Let's get to a big story, and that is a big breakthrough as far as India and Canada ties are concerned. And new high commissioners to be appointed, high commissioners to be reinstated and returning to regular services to citizens is what the Canadian side has gone on to say. Of course, the Prime Minister met with Mark Carney on the sidelines of the G7, and this is a complete breakthrough. This is carrying the hope of a reboot since the conditions and the ties between the two nations have worsened under Justin Trudeau. So under the new leadership, we're seeing this new hope and, of course, a big breakthrough underscoring India and Canada relationships are extremely important. We will work to strengthen the democratic values is what the Prime Minister Narendra Modi has gone on to reiterate it. Let's I'll go across to Maha Siddiqui, who is joining us. Let's first listen into what Mark Carney had to say about meeting with Prime Minister Modi.
The position India plays in a host of venues from G20 and beyond. So, as chair of the G7, hosting the Prime Minister in that context is entirely natural, entirely consistent. I fully expect the Prime Minister of India will be in attendance at the G7 next year, for example, in France. First thing. Secondly, in terms of the bilateral relationship, which is your question, I think the meeting today was important, but I would describe it as foundational, as a necessary first step, an exchange of views, frank, open exchange of views around law enforcement, transnational repression as two examples, an agreement to provide the necessary foundations to begin to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect, sovereignty, trust. And that begins with what was agreed, you asked for concrete, which is that we will move to appoint high commissioners again. And let me just finish by putting that in context, which is there are very deep ties of people and businesses between Canada and India. It's well known. It's part of your point about where the relationship could go. And they are not served at present by consular services, in effect, certainly by high commissioners. And it's necessary to have that level of service as a basis on which to build out, again, in the context of respect for sovereignty, and to begin to realize the potential of the relationship, and we will, we're both committed to work towards that. But there's a lot of work that will need to be done. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to close. I'm going to make one final comment, if I may. Just this is an ad lib to the question you didn't ask. What was it like in the room? I'll just say this, having been at a number of summits, G7, G20 summits, just to give a bit of a flavor. The advantage of particularly the G7 is that there are only, oddly, 9 people in the room because of the 2 extra not extra Europeans, the right amount of Europeans, but there's 2 other Europeans.
And so a big breakthrough when it comes to two relationships. And what does this really mean for India looking forward? We have Maha Siddiqui joining us from Canada to break it down for us. Maha, over to you.
The dark clouds of the conflict escalation in West Asia hovered over the G7 summit in Kananaskis in Canada. But the G7 issued a statement last evening on the second day of the summit in which they backed Israel, saying it had a right to self-defense, and also said that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. However, despite the statement that was in fact issued before US President Donald Trump, who left early from the G7 summit, again this time from Canada, but for different reasons. This time the stated reason was the situation in West Asia that led him to go back to Washington DC a day ahead of the end of the G7 summit. Donald Trump, in fact, after leaving and this morning spoke about how Emmanuel Macron had misinterpreted his departure from the G7 summit earlier, because Emmanuel Macron has said that it should be seen positively that Donald Trump was trying to look for a ceasefire. Donald Trump said that this is far from what should be expected at the moment. In fact, now, after that, when Macron was asked by reporters about this issue, he said that it was a grave error, as has been seen in the past, if a regime change is sought in any country by bombing it from the outside by outsiders, and that any such change, if required by a country, should come from within. This clearly showed that divergence in the views on the approach in West Asia or Middle East for the G7, as the leaders continue to talk in different voices over the approach, despite the fact that they have come out with a statement together. Now, this time the G7 has issued 7 different statements and not a big joint communique. These 7 statements include one on Israel and Iran. The other ones are, the important ones are on AI and prosperity, that is artificial intelligence and prosperity, and especially the intersection of artificial intelligence and energy consumption is also a matter of discussion at the moment on the table. Apart from that, issues like critical minerals, a statement being issued by the G7 on that as well, and to use the resources sustainably, as well as a statement on the issue of wildfire, something that is very critical in North America, and also once again the use or the means of sustainable infrastructure that should be created to combat and to be able to manage wildfires that have been very devastating in North America, especially in the host country Canada, which has seen wildfires and very recently saw one that broke out in the Squamish region. The G7 summit has closed today, with Donald Trump having left earlier. The other G7 leaders engaged this morning as well, after which all these 7 statements were released. In Kananaskis, this is Maha Siddiqui for NDTV.
Right, Maha, stay with us. Of course, let's just also talk about that bilateral meeting that's taken place on the sidelines of the G7 between Prime Minister Modi and his counterpart Mark Carney. Well, their bilateral meet carries the hope of a reboot, and this is in connection with the ties. Of course, we did see, an all-time low under Justin Trudeau, but, this is, of course, something that both sides have agreed upon, talking about how together they can strengthen democracy. Let's listen into what Vikram Mishri had to say.
Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada have just a short while ago concluded a very positive and constructive meeting on the sidelines of the G7 summit here in Kananaskis in Canada. The meeting discussed the importance of the India-Canada relationship, which is based on shared values, democracy and the rule of law, people-to-people contact, and many other commonalities.
Well, Prime Minister Modi at the G7 high table, with the 7 so-called most powerful nations in the world, even though President Trump has, of course, stepped away, and we've seen what he's been saying overnight as well about controlling the skies over Iran. The context of this G7 visit has obviously taken on a very global, very different color, and there is a sense of urgency to what is happening, because India, one of the preeminent powers in a region where a near war scenario is rapidly escalating. You have one side talking about the obliteration of the other side. You've got the other side saying, it ain't over until it's over. And you've got the most powerful world leaders, Prime Minister Modi, along with the G7 right there in Canada, talking, I imagine, largely about how the fallout of this entire Iran-Israel conflict is going to be like for all of these countries, most definitely in India, is an extremely important forum. It goes beyond just the G7. And remember that the Prime Minister's arrival in Canada, the welcome there at the G7 is an important one, because all of these countries see India as not just a regional power, but an unignorable element in the international order, especially in the context of a world that's become exceedingly more dangerous in the last few weeks. The Iran-Israel conflict has repercussions for the rest of the world, normalizing things, especially a couple of days after Prime Minister Modi had in Cyprus said, something that he has said many times since the beginning of the Ukraine war, that this is an era of peace, not an era of war, is something that should reverberate out of Canada to the rest of the world. Whether it has an impact on Iran and Israel is unlikely at this point of time. These are two countries looking to really settle everything once and for all with each other. So at this time, with President Trump, who obviously left before the Prime Minister arrived, saying that he had a sideways jibe at President Macron of France, saying, he talked about me leaving because of some ceasefire. That just shows how wrong he is. I think all of this makes it very important as far as the global G7 recognition on India's preeminent position as a peacemaker and a peace preserver in the region. So this is not just an observer status or a special invitee status at the G7. Modi at the G7 is very important to what's happening in one of the most dangerous places in the world right now.